Crimea has long been the center of Russia's entire military strategy in the war in Ukraine. Since Moscow annexed the peninsula in 2014, it has not only become a symbol of power that Vladimir Putin has always tried to protect at all costs, but also a key military fortress for Russia in the Black Sea. However, a new development is beginning to emerge on the battlefield. Ukraine is gradually putting pressure on this very strategic corridor. What we are witnessing may be something the Kremlin never expected, because if Ukraine can bring the Crimea Land Bridge within its fire control range, the entire Russian logistics system in the south could start to falter or even collapse. At first glance, this may seem like a bold statement. When looking at current battlefield maps, many might think Ukraine is still very far from the Crimea goal. Their advances appear to only aim at weakening Russian forces and preparing for larger battles in the future. And that is partly true. However, those very advances are laying the foundation for a much larger objective, because Crimea is not just occupied territory, it is one of the most important logistics nodes in Russia's entire military campaign. If the land corridor connecting Russia to Crimea is placed under Ukrainian fire control, the entire structure of Moscow's war in the south could be broken. In other words, the Crimea corridor is a strategic target. Keep following, and we will see why what Ukraine is doing today may be opening the path to the liberation of Crimea in the future. But before going that far, first we need to look at what is really happening on the battlefield right now. The developments on the southern Ukrainian battlefield in recent weeks are showing a reality. The initiative is gradually shifting to Kyiv's side. The focal point of this change lies in Zaporizhia province, especially along the strategic Orikhiv-Tokmak axis and the Huviapol area. These are areas that Russia once considered key defensive lines to protect the land corridor leading to Crimea. However, according to reports from Reuters and the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, Ukrainian forces are continuously pressuring Russian positions here. Ukrainian units have liberated several additional small settlements in the frontline area, captured important tactical high grounds, and forced Russian forces to withdraw from some forward defensive positions that have been built since 2022. These advances may look modest if only viewed on the battlefield map, but the numbers show a much more serious picture for the Russian side. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that in recent operations in the Zaporizhia direction alone, Russian forces suffered over 6,500 casualties, of which approximately 4,300 soldiers were confirmed as irrecoverable losses. In addition, 419 units of Russian military equipment were destroyed or disabled, including 147 artillery systems, more than 240 military transport vehicles, and at least 14 infantry fighting vehicles. Beyond that, Ukraine also destroyed 108 Russian drone control stations, significantly weakening their reconnaissance and fire coordination capabilities on the battlefield. These losses are not just numbers. They reflect a profound tactical shift. First, the multi-layered defensive line that Russia built around Tokmak is gradually being eroded. This defensive system was once reinforced by Russian military engineers with dense minefields, anti-tank trenches, dragon's teeth barriers, and multiple layers of concrete fortifications stretching dozens of kilometers. But under continuous pressure from precision artillery and Ukrainian FPV drones, these defensive lines are losing effectiveness. Second, the areas between the two sides are turning into gray zones, disputed areas where Ukraine can continuously attack with artillery, drones, and small assault units, making Russian movement extremely dangerous. These zones sometimes extend up to 10 kilometers behind the front line, turning every Russian supply convoy into an easy target. And third, every kilometer Ukraine advances southward brings them closer to Tokmak, Russia's key logistics hub in the entire southern defensive system. This is particularly noteworthy because Tokmak was once promoted by Moscow as an impregnable fortress. Russian media repeatedly claimed that the city was protected by hundreds of kilometers of occupied territory, making it impossible for Ukraine to approach. But the battlefield reality is showing a different picture. That fortress is gradually becoming Ukraine's next target, and if Tokmak is truly placed under serious pressure, the strategic consequences will quickly spread. From Tokmak, the road to Melitopol, Russia's largest logistics center in the south, is only about 40 kilometers. When Melitopol is brought within Ukrainian fire control range, the entire logistics corridor connecting Russia to Crimea will begin to shake. In other words, the seemingly small advances in Zaporizhia today may be the first links in a much larger chain of events. And when that chain is complete, Crimea, something the Kremlin considers an unthreatenable strategic stronghold, may no longer be out of Ukraine's reach. One of the key reasons why Ukraine can exert increasing pressure on Russia's defensive lines in Zaporizhia lies in the tactic that military analysts call gray zone warfare. This is a method of fighting that Ukraine has developed and perfected over 2 years of war particularly to counter the multi-layered defensive systems that Russia began building in the summer of 2022 after withdrawing from Kherson. These defensive lines are far from simple. They include dense minefields, anti-tank trenches, dragon's teeth concrete barriers, fortified strongpoints, and artillery systems deployed in depth. In many areas of Zaporizhzhia, ISW analysts estimate mine density can reach 3 to 5 mines per square meter. A traditional frontal assault into such a defensive system would almost certainly result in very heavy casualties. And that is exactly why Ukraine does not choose a direct assault. Instead, Kyiv employs a slower but more effective method, turning Russian defensive areas into gray zones, meaning disputed zones where neither side can maintain full control. The way this tactic works is quite simple but extremely effective. First, Ukraine conducts precision artillery strikes on Russian positions, targeting ammunition depots, logistics assembly points, and artillery systems. At the same time, swarms of reconnaissance drones and FPV drones are deployed to locate and attack mobile targets, such as tanks, armored vehicles, and supply trucks. When Russian supply lines begin to be disrupted, small Ukrainian assault units, often consisting of just a few dozen soldiers, advance to seize key positions such as high ground or small villages. As a result, areas that were once under stable Russian control become chaotic and turn into gray zones. In these zones, no side can move safely. Every Russian supply convoy risks being detected and attacked by drones within minutes. The tactical cycle then repeats in a familiar pattern. Ukraine disrupts Russian logistics. The defensive area turns into a gray zone. Assault units attack piecemeal, clear weak positions, then consolidate a new defensive line before continuing to push the front southward. The role of drones in this entire process is extremely important. On the current Ukrainian battlefield, reconnaissance drones constantly fly overhead, transmitting real-time images to command centers. As soon as a Russian vehicle moves or a supply convoy appears, FPV drones can be directed straight into the target. According to many estimates from Western analysts, drones now cause about 70% of casualties on the Ukrainian battlefield. This makes every Russian logistics operation in gray zones extremely dangerous. Meanwhile, Russian tactics still largely rely on familiar Soviet-era methods, massive artillery barrages, and large-scale infantry assaults. These tactics were once very effective in 20th century wars, but in a modern battlefield environment full of drones and sensors, they often lead to extremely heavy casualties. In reality, in many Russian assaults in eastern Ukraine in 2024 and 2025, Russian units lost hundreds of soldiers just to gain a few hundred meters of territory. In contrast, the gray zone tactic allows Ukraine to advance slowly but steadily, gradually wearing down Russian forces without paying the price of bloody assaults. Every kilometer Ukraine advances may take many days or weeks, but the price Russia pays to hold each position is becoming increasingly expensive. And it is this very tactic that is gradually opening the path for Ukraine to move closer to a much larger strategic goal in the south, cutting off the logistics corridor connecting Russia to Crimea. But the gray zone tactic is only part of a much larger story unfolding on the Ukrainian battlefield. What truly enables Kyiv to gain an advantage over a larger opponent in manpower and weapons is a technological revolution in warfare taking place right in the midst of this conflict. In many recent military reports, Western analysts estimate that drones now cause about 70 to 80% of total casualties on the Ukrainian battlefield. This figure shows the profound change in modern warfare. If in previous wars artillery and air forces played the leading role, then in Ukraine today, the low sky above the front line has become the domain of thousands of unmanned aerial vehicles. Ukraine has exploited this better than any other army in the war. Kyiv's forces now use many different types of drones, each performing a distinct role on the battlefield. First are reconnaissance drones, usually small quadcopters flying low over the battlefield to detect enemy movements. These drones continuously transmit real-time images to command centers, allowing Ukrainian units to know the exact location of Russian tanks, artillery, or supply convoys. Next are FPV kamikaze drones, one of the iconic weapons of this war. These small but extremely dangerous drones are controlled directly through virtual reality goggles, allowing the operator to crash straight into the target with astonishing accuracy. With a cost of just a few $100s, one FPV drone can destroy a tank worth millions of dollars. And finally, there are long-range attack drones used to strike deep targets behind the front line, from ammunition depots and air bases to military factories on Russian territory. The Ukrainian government has announced plans to produce millions of drones per year, a strategy showing that Kyiv clearly understands the central role of this technology in the war. The result of that strategy is a phenomenon that many Russian frontline soldiers call by a rather terrifying name: drone wall. In some frontline areas, especially in Zaporozhye and Donetsk, the sky is almost always filled with drones flying around. Hundreds of reconnaissance and attack drones constantly monitor the battlefield, making any vehicle or group of soldiers moving in the open at risk of immediate detection. In such an environment, daytime movement becomes extremely dangerous for Russian units. But drones are only part of a larger system that Ukraine is building. Behind these drones is a modern data warfare network that experts call network-centric warfare. At the center of this system is the DELTA command and control platform. This is a digital system developed by Ukraine before the full-scale war began in 2022. Delta operates as a real-time battlefield map, integrating data from drones, satellite imagery, battlefield sensors, and other intelligence sources. When a reconnaissance drone detects a target, that information can immediately appear on the Delta system. From there, artillery units, FPV drones, or assault units can quickly be coordinated to strike the target. What is noteworthy is that this system is not just for high-level command centers. Any Ukrainian unit on the battlefield can access Delta through a laptop, tablet, or even smartphone, as long as they have a data connection. This creates a level of battlefield awareness that many armies around the world are still trying to achieve. Meanwhile, the Russian side still largely relies on old-style command and control models originating from the Soviet era. These systems are often slower in transmitting information and less flexible in coordinating forces on the battlefield. The result is an increasingly clear difference. Ukraine is waging a data-driven, real-time information war, while Russia is still fighting in the way familiar from the last century, and this creates quite an ironic paradox on the modern battlefield. Russia may have more tanks, more artillery, and even more soldiers, but if they cannot see the target before being detected, those assets simply become perfect targets for FPV drones. In a war where information and speed decide everything, Ukraine's technological advantage is gradually turning Russia's defensive lines into increasingly vulnerable systems. And when that advantage combines with the gray zone tactic that Ukraine is applying in Zaporizhia, the path southward and ultimately to Crimea begins to become clearer than ever. And all of those elements, gray zone tactics, drones, and network-centric warfare ultimately converge on one strategic objective that Western military analysts have mentioned for many years: the Crimea Land Bridge, or the land corridor connecting Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. This is the Achilles heel of Russia's entire military structure in southern Ukraine. On the map, this corridor starts from Russian territory in the Rostov region, runs through Mariupol, continues through Berdyansk, then to Melitopol, and finally connects to Crimea. After seizing most of this area in the early months of the 2022 invasion, Russia turned it into the most important supply line for all their forces in southern Ukraine. Through this corridor, the Russian military transports almost everything needed for war: soldiers, ammunition, fuel, tanks, artillery, and other military equipment. The road and rail lines running through Tokmak and Melitopol have become the lifeline of Russia's entire military campaign in the region. If you look at Russia's logistics map, Melitopol resembles a huge transfer hub where supply routes from Russia converge before being distributed to units fighting in Zaporizhye and Kherson. And at the end of that corridor is Crimea, the center of Russia's war in the Black Sea region. This peninsula not only hosts the Sevastopol naval base, headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, but also contains many strategic air bases, early warning radar systems, and S-300 and S-400 air defense complexes protecting the area. Throughout the war, Russia has used Crimea as a launchpad for numerous missile attacks on Ukrainian cities from Kyiv to Odessa. In addition, military airfields in Crimea serve as takeoff points for many Russian tactical bombers and fighter jets. In other words, Crimea is not just a political symbol for Putin, it is a core part of Russia's entire war system in Ukraine. But this very dependence also creates an extremely dangerous strategic vulnerability. If Ukraine can advance far enough south to capture Tokmak and put pressure on Melitopol, they can establish what military experts call fire control over the entire Crimea corridor. Fire control does not necessarily mean Ukraine has to fully occupy the area. It only means Ukraine has the ability to strike any supply convoy, logistics train, or military base along this corridor with artillery, drones, or long-range missiles. When that happens, the consequences for Russia will be very serious. In theory, Russia can still hold the territory they control, but if they cannot safely transport ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements, Russian units on the battlefield will gradually weaken. An army without logistics is simply an army waiting to fail. What makes the situation ironic for Moscow is that for many years the Kremlin believed this corridor was completely safe. After capturing Mariupol and Melitopol in 2022, Russia assumed that hundreds of kilometers of occupied territory between Ukraine and Crimea had created a large enough buffer zone to protect this supply line. The multi-layered defensive lines, dense minefields, and artillery units positioned along the corridor were thought to prevent any Ukrainian attempt to approach the area. But war rarely goes according to the initial plan. Ukraine's slow but steady advances in Zaporizhia are gradually breaking that assumption. Every kilometer Ukrainian forces advance southward reduces the distance between them and Russia's supply lines. Tokmak, once considered an impregnable fortress, is now gradually becoming a strategic vulnerability, and if Tokmak is seriously threatened, Melitopol, the logistics hub of the entire corridor, will be the next target. When that happens, the Crimea Land Bridge will no longer be a safe supply route, but will turn into a corridor vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. In other words, what Moscow once considered its greatest strategic advantage in southern Ukraine is gradually turning into a deadly weakness. And what worries the Kremlin most is that Ukraine is getting closer to that weakness 1 kilometer at a time, and we are beginning to see clearly why the Crimea Land Bridge is considered by many military analysts to be Russia's Achilles heel. If Ukraine can advance far enough to establish fire control over this corridor, scenario that Moscow previously considered impossible, the strategic consequences for Russia will be extremely serious. First, Russian forces operating in southern Ukraine will immediately face a logistics crisis. Units stationed in Kherson and Zaporizhia rely heavily on road and rail lines running through Tokmak and Melitopol for supplies. Through these routes, Russia transports artillery shells, fuel, food, and reinforcements from Crimea and from Russian territory. If Ukraine can continuously strike logistics trains, supply convoys, and transfer depots along this corridor with artillery, drones, and long-range missiles, maintaining a large force at the front will become extremely difficult. In modern warfare, logistics is not just an important factor, it is the condition for the survival of an entire army. A unit can hold a position for a few days when short of ammunition or fuel, but it cannot do so for weeks. The second consequence will directly affect Crimea. When the land corridor is placed under Ukrainian fire control, the peninsula will be almost completely isolated logistically. Russia will then be forced to rely almost entirely on the Kerch Bridge and sea transport routes across the Black Sea to supply its forces. But both of these routes have already proven far from safe. The Kerch Bridge has been attacked multiple times since 2022, causing significant damage and forcing Russia to restrict traffic during many periods. Meanwhile, sea transport across the Black Sea is becoming increasingly risky as Ukraine continuously uses naval drones and anti-ship missiles to attack Russian warships and supply vessels. In fact, these attacks have forced a large part of the Black Sea fleet to withdraw from Sevastopol and move to farther ports such as Novorossiysk. And that leads to the third consequence, perhaps the most worrying for Moscow. If Ukraine can advance close enough to establish fire control over the Crimea corridor, they will also have more favorable positions to conduct deep strikes into the peninsula. Russian air bases, ammunition depots, command centers, and even warships at Sevastopol will become more accessible targets for Ukrainian drones and missiles. In that context, Crimea will no longer be a safe fortress that Russia can use to dominate the southern battlefield. Instead, it risks becoming an isolated outpost under constant attack, and this is the strategic nightmare that the Kremlin has long tried to avoid. The peninsula that Putin once considered a symbol of Russian power in the Black Sea could turn into the biggest weakness in the entire war. Looking at the entire current battlefield picture, one thing needs to be made clear: Ukraine has not yet liberated Crimea, and the road to achieving that goal is certainly still long. But for the first time since Russia annexed the peninsula in 2014, the path to that possibility has become clearer than ever. What is happening in Zaporizhia is not random advances or small isolated victories on the map. It is a calculated strategy in which Ukraine is gradually pushing the front southward, eroding Russia's defensive system and slowly breaking the supply lines that sustain all Russian forces in southern Ukraine. By combining gray zone tactics, continuous drone strikes, and a modern data warfare system, Ukraine is doing what Moscow once thought impossible, advancing slowly but surely toward the Crimea corridor. Meanwhile, the picture on the Russian side is becoming increasingly difficult. The Russian army continues to suffer heavy casualties, is gradually losing the initiative on the battlefield, and is facing more and more difficulties in maintaining stable supply lines for its forces. The numerical advantages that Russia once relied on in the early stages of the war are gradually being neutralized by technology, flexible tactics, and Ukraine's persistence. This leads to a strategic paradox. Russia may still control a lot of territory, but the ability to hold those territories is weakening month by month. And if Ukraine continues to advance southward, 1 kilometer at a time, until they can establish fire control over the Crimea Land Bridge, then what the Kremlin once considered impregnable could quickly turn into a fatal weakness. At that point, The Crimean Peninsula, something Vladimir Putin once used as a symbol of Russia's strength and revival, may no longer be a symbol of victory. Instead, it could become the starting point for Moscow's greatest strategic failure in this entire war. If you want to follow the latest analyses of the Ukrainian battlefield and global strategic developments, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next battlefield update.